Well, thanks first of all for inviting me, for organizing this event. It had been very interesting for me, for one reason amongst others, that it brings together a variety of different disciplines, of different ways of thinking, of different practice behind it. The ambassador called just in his last contribution for a philosopher, so I thought I come and start as philosopher. But in this function I will actually talk, I hope, about economics. The crisis had been mentioned, and it had been mentioned in this way that it is in which way ever point of departure of all these debates. And it had been mentioned as well frequently that we are approaching it in a different way, as a crisis in negative terms, the glass being half full and half empty, and in the other way that the glass is actually half full. But the question is as well, in which way ever you can take it, if the glass is actually broken and we have to think about a new glass. The last contribution is something in this direction. I'm not talking about fundamental and far-reaching change, but I think we have to think in new ways. Part of it is talking about crisis, talking about economics. Part of it is, of course, the question of growth. Growth is the standard measure, and usually we take GDP, but it had been mentioned as well yesterday in one contribution we have to think about development. Development is, of course, not something that we can easily measure, but it is an important thing that we have to keep in mind. The grand leading principle towards which every argument unfolded in these pages directly converges is the absolute and essential importance of human development in its richest diversity. Wilhelm von Humboldt, some of you may have figured out the reference. But development of what? As I said, it's a kind of vague term. It had been mentioned in some debates, some contributions, the question of the role of Germany in particular, or the role of some countries against the others. The question for me is, seeing the problematic behind it, that we have to think about as well the opportunity or the possibility to overcome actually hegemonic thinking. Hegemonic thinking as one-sided orientation, be it in terms of countries, be it in terms of one measurement for everything. Is it about rational policy making? This would be another thing of developing rationality in policy making. I was struck yesterday by James Galbraith referring to the Troika pushing for a new way or new stage of austerity. On the 4th of October, the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF actually rebuked the entire work of austerity, saying this had been wrong. And this had been wrong, meaning it was wrong in terms of damaging some countries at least, and some groups of the population to a tremendous degree. Growth, as I said, and this is one point where I think we have to think seriously about, growth in terms of GDP is an obsession today. It is still considered, and we are dealing with economics as the one and only measurement that pushes everything forward and everything else will come. What is the basis of this growth? Individualism. Individualism is a condition for growth-oriented politics, growth-oriented economics. It is not about solidarity, it is not about thinking first society, thinking first an entirety, and then thinking about what is actually the individual or how is the individual profited by it. The externalization of costs, whatever, environmental cost, financial cost, is a tremendous burden to the entire development. And there we see actually the point what had been mentioned, what is done or had been done by Germany in particular, but as well by other countries, now pushing the costs by austerity measures to the Mediterranean area. The other thing is employment. Employment is always still thought in the standard measurement of full-time employment, lifelong employment as the standard. I think, and I'll come back later to this, we should think about social work, not in terms of the professional work as social worker, but in terms of the social activities we undertake. And then there is the other thing of reflexivity. This entire system, and it had been issued by reference to the financialization, is a increasingly reflexive system. There's another one, actually, that we have to think about that is social production in terms of needs-oriented, utility-oriented economics. All this comes together in an accumulation regime, which is not only a matter of how we produce and what we produce, but it is as well a matter of the consumption. Both are strictly joined together, and the classical example is Fordism, as it had been called. The Ford T model was the first mass production, really, in the strict sense. Everybody could have this, and this is an important point, and it had been mass production. You could have it in every color, you know this joke, but it had to be black. It developed to another orientation, post-Fordism, called in economics, political economy, flexibility and desocialized production, meaning individual companies could produce their products in a very flexible way, and the products and the process of production had been kind of desocialized. Individuals producing, but still in the old framework. I think we moved already beyond this. I called it at some stage Gates-Jobsian model. It's not Fordist, it's not post-Fordist, but it is a new way of using resources, using this accumulation or establishing this accumulation regime. It's new forms of employment, not just flexible, but what we know as precarious. There is as well an individualized mass production and social consumption. Further individualized is the self-realization in arbitrary social spaces. We are not limited to our traditional orientation of space, of enterprise, but these are floating, kind of flexibly moving entities. It's today here, it's today somewhere else. I lived for many years in Ireland, and the Irish boom was very much based on this, a short-term boom, enterprises leaving after that. In real life of many people, the younger generation had been mentioned, it is now considered to be the EasyJet generation. Individuals socializing by identifying with brands. Branding is the new keyword, and it is not about products as such that we use, but it is about brands by which we form our identity and form it in a social way, so-called social way. Economically, there is a relatively simple mechanism behind it that increasingly the capital stock, the investment is actually taking over, and variable capital, as it's called, human labor, is not continuing the role it had. But at the same time, we have increasingly simply quantitative, an orientation that variable capital, human labor, takes a new form, takes new forms, and has an increasing role. I mentioned precarious work, and there is this in a way, interesting development that we see people working in their own enterprises. This is a coffee shop with internet connection. They have their own computer, and this is an enterprise. As well, they can be today here, tomorrow somewhere else. They can produce one thing the one day, and next week they go to another point. The entire thing, and this is coming back to development, is a matter of, I think, 4 important points. Disembedding. The economic processes are disembedded, are not part of the social entirety, but are reflexive and only maintaining themselves. GDP growth is the only thing. If something can be usefully sold, it's another question, and sometimes it has to be, but nobody can tell me that some brands are really useful as such. The other thing is exactly this virtuality. The products are increasingly virtual, and we see this even that we are part of this process of production ourselves. We book our flights, we check in online, and we are even going through security, which is now in many places automized. The other thing is that market is seen as the only regulator. Polanyi, an Hungarian Austrian economist, investigated this. It is a long process. It's not just only a recent matter, but it is of increasingly of importance. The other thing is capitalization of everything. Social capital is actually, for me, some term where I'm always hesitating. Is the social capital really social capital, or is simply social interaction something that we do not in terms of orienting towards a calculable entity, but in terms of we do it as human beings because we are human, we are social beings. Going back on track, this had been as well standing at the beginning of this conference, is not possible. James Galbraith mentioned it. It does not seem viable that we simply go back by any short-term orientation measures. I think as well that the current crisis, as we say, has huge potentials. And we just have to look how can we actually mobilize them to have a new quality of economic activities, but as well of social and societal developments. In yesterday's session, before the actual conference, there had been the call for objectives. We have to go, we have to know, we have to figure out where we want to go. I think if we look, and I can only do it briefly, if we look at the current situation, we have some potentials where we can say these are objectives we can set for policymaking. Productivity. We have a huge potential of productivity. OECD. This is something where we can go and where we don't have to look and say, well, sorry, everything is going down and we don't know where and what to produce. We can produce, and we can produce very useful things, and we don't have to feed the money, the surplus money, into financial markets for speculation. Regulation. There had been today, I think, the mention of micro and macroeconomics. I think we have to think more, and this is a very concrete demand as well to policymakers on the regional level, or even on the local level, on the regional level, national level, and European and other levels. We have to add a global perspective, global economics. It's not micro, it's not macroeconomics, but it is something where we can actually establish or develop an accounting system that takes everything, every cost, every benefit into account. This does not allow, and this is the important point in terms of globalization, it does not allow externalization. It does not allow externalization in time. We pay tomorrow. We won't pay tomorrow, our children won't be able to pay. There's another thing which is linked to planning. We face huge potentials in terms of governance. Government, actually we don't have it anymore in the strict sense. The nation state doesn't have the power anymore. The regional bodies like the European Union does not have it yet. But the question is, should we think simply in these terms, or should we think about different ways of establishing a ruled system, a system with fixed rules of democratic perception to approach this? There are many things going on the United Nations, on the European Union level, the inclusion of NGOs in policy-making processes, but it is very much a kind of unknown field where it's difficult to systematically approach this. I think there is much to do, and we have to do it urgently before there is actually a new conflict in political terms, everything going away. Identity. Identity, I don't think about identity now in this arbitrary social space. I think about identity that we have to go back to education and to what is claimed in Lisbon, or had been claimed in Lisbon in 2000, knowledge-based society. Currently, I never understood actually this term. What they have had in mind and what they are striving for is a skill-based information technology orientation and not education. I had been working, and I'm still working at universities. If I see the narrowing down of educational processes, it is saddening, especially, and then I come back to the potential, especially if I see students who tell me frankly, how many points can I get? If it's enough, I do it. If it's not enough, I would be interested, but I cannot do it. This is, I think, a huge burden for the future generations and as well for our thinking. Then, final point here, the enterprises. We have a crisis that enterprises are in a crisis. But it came up in several contributions in side remarks. There is as well a matter of the crisis of the model of entrepreneurship. We should, and there had been presentations pointing on this already, we should rethink the model of the enterprise. What is, and actually we can go back, this existed already before, we can go back to the social responsibility. But it is not just something I take on voluntarily, but we have to think about it in more concrete terms and more obliging terms. Small and medium enterprises, they still exist, they still have a huge important role, but at the same time they are completely depending on others. The social economy, I think, is something where we have to think about further, that it is really something that should play and can play a very important role in the development. I started with a reference to philosophy. I come back to this at the end. We frequently talk about values. We frequently talk about or refer to Aristotle, especially. The values that are behind the European model, the values that are guiding through us today, up to today, and that are still important. But when it comes to the definition of these values, we fail. We have some vague definition in mind, but we do not link this definition immediately to these economic processes. And I think this is what we have to do. Aristotle was thinking about these terms. He was philosopher, he was economist, if we would take our terms today. I think this is important for today. This is important coming through the objectives as well for the conference. In this way, I want for the objectives, for setting objectives. In this way, I want to come back to thank the organizers, giving the opportunity to such an exchange. And I want to conclude with a short reference to Immanuel Kant. Enlightenment is man's emergence from himself incurred immaturity. This self-incurred immaturity is what we have to overcome. Thank you very much.